Today's program is a collaborative effort from Greg Hedges. If you want to put your hand up there, Greg, to make sure people know who you are. Managing Director with Protiviti, and Gary Gerstmann, if you want to raise your hand, Gary, corporate partner with Sidley. We simply could not offer you this type of programming and access to this content without the support of all of our generous sponsors that also include Marie Norman, Houlihan Lokey, KPMG, Perlmeyer, Accenture, Financial Profiles, and our newest sponsor in the board portal category, Passageways. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Gary to do brief introductions of the panel and explain how the program will flow this morning. Thank you all panel members for helping us out today.
Great. Thank you, Holly. I'm Gary Gerstmann, a corporate partner at Sidley based in Chicago and co-leader of the firm's technology industry group. We have a great panel today to discuss governance, ethics, and legal considerations relating to customer data. With us today are Greg Hedges, Managing Director of Protiviti. Greg works with boards and management teams to devise strategies on how technology and analytics can improve operations. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches a course on ethics and analytics. Anna Remus is a partner at Sidley in the technology and IP practice. She's based in San Francisco and regularly counsels clients on corporate innovation strategies and data-driven opportunities. Dennis Self is the CEO of global marketing technology company Acoustic. Previously, he served as president and CEO of database marketing company Acxiom. He has also held senior roles at Deloitte, Gilead Sciences, and Electronic Arts. For today's program, we're going to start with opening remarks from each of the panelists. We'll then move into Q&A. At that time, as Holly mentioned, participants should feel free to unmute and ask a question. Please introduce yourself when asking a question. Our goal is to make this session as interactive as possible. We'll then have some brief closing comments and key takeaways. So Greg, I'll turn it over to you to get us started. How would you go ahead and frame today's discussion?
Thanks, Gary. And I would frame it around what is the gap between what's possible and what's ethical. And I found that in preparing for this, that ethics can be mind-bending. You get into moral theory, and there's so much out there that it can be exhausting. So what I wanted to do was really just boil it down and share with you some key perspectives to help frame what's going on for today. Really kind of asking those questions: what would an organization like to do? What can be legally done? And then what can be done technically? Now, business is very anxious to leverage ethics. And it's something that can be easily talked about. My firm, Protiviti, one of the I's are all of our values, for example, innovation, inclusion, and integrity. So right off the bat, integrity is table stakes at Protiviti, just like many of your corporate company value statements are. An NACD member firm, Arthur J. Gallagher, has a chief ethics officer, Tom Trop, and they are 9 years running in the list of most ethical companies to do business with. We know it makes a lot of sense to do and focus on ethics. And what ethics is not, it's not the law. The law is the minimum behavior that we deploy for societal order. I mean, it's not illegal to be rude, for example. I'd be in big trouble if it were. I stumble into that. But if you kind of think about it, it's not illegal to be rude, but is that how you would manage your relationships with customers? Is that how you would treat them? Well, of course not. That is not a best practice. So the idea is, how do you then figure out what is the right way to treat customers and customers' information? So let's pop to the next slide, Kathy. And there are 4 ethical filters that are pretty just standard issue when it comes to ethics. When Tom Trop, who is the chief ethics officer of Gallagher, came to Notre Dame and spoke to our students, he really kind of helped me understand these lenses. So the first on that utilitarian, there's 4 questions that you can ask. And the reason I'm bringing this up, and you'll see on the 2-pager, it's a governance framework. It's maybe something that your companies might have to evaluate their actions on the use of customer information, or really any action that they want to take. So on the utilitarian side, when it comes to customer relationships, you kind of want to ask, is what we're going to do going to benefit the market? Are the pros and the cons of how we want to use that customer information going to be of broad use and benefit the market? So that's one angle to take a look at. Another is in human rights. Well, there's lots of human rights: life, liberty, security, food, clothing, and housing, healthcare, all of these things. There's dozens and dozens of human rights. And from the human rights perspective, one thing that a company might say is, well, I didn't break any laws. You just want to make sure you don't trample on any of these rights. Now, is that the best way to look at customer information? Probably not. It almost sounds like you're being defensive. I don't want to break the law, which is important. And Anna's going to talk a lot about that in this space, but it's just the minimum. On the justice perspective, that's another question to make sure that equals are really treated equally. Is it really going to, from a customer relationship perspective, you would ask on the justice side, is it going to really benefit the brand? Is what we're going to do going to take care of and help the market? You want to make sure that people are treated equally and unequal people are treated unequally. So this is where it gets into all of when things are violated. Is there money that needs to be paid because somebody did something wrong? Or what's the best way to distribute the benefits of some action? So I think, and also, does somebody need to be punished? And if you have to go to prison for something that you did, is it the right amount of time for that particular action or not? That's all that justice perspective. It's another ethical lens. And then finally, care. This is the one that is important to take a look at the relationship. You are entrusted by your customers to take care of the information that they have. So is what you're doing going to really help make sure that that the customer relationship of service provider to customer is being protected? And you want to make sure that because you're entrusted with that care, that you're not trampling over that responsibility as well. Now, the trouble is, with all of these ethical filters, they're not equal. So for the most part, the utilitarian view and the human rights view and justice, I mean, which one do you think is the most important? It seems like that human rights is going to be more important than, well, we did a calculation and determined that there's more benefit for us using this information in this way than not. And whereas if you're trampling over human rights, that could even trump that. The point is there a process to even evaluate these things when individuals in a company are evaluating the use of information? And I'm going to just advance that what we're finding is that many do not. And there's really been a struggle as we've found organizations building a data and analytics program to make sure that they themselves know, well, what's the ethical use of this information or what isn't. So now it's easy to have all of these academic pictures and diagrams and ethical theory and all of that, and to just espouse it and suggest governance over it in a process. But I'm going to turn it over to the chief executive officer of a company that handles information day to day and protects those rights every single day and makes those decisions. It's Dennis Self. He's the CEO of Acoustic. And Dennis, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be invited here today. Most of you likely have not heard of Acoustic. The company's been around for about 1.5 years. We carved out IBM's Marketing Cloud assets to become Acoustic. It's a company that's held by a private equity firm named Centerbridge. So we're in the process of standing up a new company and taking out a next generation marketing cloud out to market. That does differentiate on the basis of how we use consumer data. And that's a very important construct for a lot of companies in terms of how they interact with their customers is how do I access consumer data, and how do I leverage that consumer data to interact with consumers on a day-to-day basis. Some of the things that I just wanted to mention here very quickly are a recap or emphasizing things that Greg has already mentioned. When you hear the term data privacy, that's responsibly collecting, using, and storing data about people in line with the expectations of various regulations and laws. Data privacy focuses on legal compliance, and it is the minimum bar that we all must clear when we're addressing this important topic. Data ethics, however, that goes beyond legal compliance, and that's to ensure that data use is fair and just. Data ethics is doing the right thing with data. Consumer data in particular, for today's discussion, it's being considered of the customer or the human impact from all sides, and making decisions based on what your company and your brand values. The key here is to ask, what is fair? What is the right thing to do? And to ask, just because we can do it, should we do it? Most companies collect data today, and in this context, collect customer data. And that's to improve the consumer experience or the customer experience, and to enable a value exchange between the business and the consumer. So lots of data is being collected to allow that to happen. And from what I see, good companies use this data in responsible and ethical ways. They use data to understand their customers, to reach people interested in their goods and services. These responsible companies typically don't want to interact with customers who will find their products and services irrelevant. It's wasteful, and it harms their brand when they do that. Good companies believe ethical use of data genuinely benefits people, their consumers. These same responsible companies allow people to opt out of that data, out of that data set being used for various purposes. But even with opt-outs, marketing ads, as an example, won't stop. They'll continue. But the problem is that they'll be random and they'll be irrelevant. But when companies work with consumers, that's where they can set up a value exchange, and that's where they can make sure that the experiences that those brands are creating are efficient and are relevant.
I think we'll toss it to Anna and give her perspective. We've kind of said the law is the minimum bar, right? I think she needs to and I think ethics actually kind of criticizes law. The ethics is like, well, the law is just this; it needs to be higher. So I think it's time for Anna to have a word or two here. How about that?
Thanks so much, and thanks to NACD for having me here today. Let me start with kind of a little bit about my clients and my practice, so we understand kind of the angle I'm speaking from. I work with companies who have access to large amounts of data, who are providing technology solutions, and we're counseling those platform providers, for example, on sort of where the lines are, what they can and can't do, what they should and shouldn't do. And also, I also work plenty of times on the sort of customer side. So those are companies with data who are sharing their data for any number of reasons. It may be simply to receive a service, and then we're analyzing, what other things might the service provider be able to do. We also work a lot with companies developing innovative new technology, using data for all sorts of reasons, including possibly just helping develop their models, test their machine learning technology, build their algorithms. And so we counsel companies from that angle as well. Importantly, I consult with my experts in our DC regulatory practice when we're talking about sort of the ins and outs of regulations around personal information and, customer data when it gets down to the kind of individual level, which I know, Dennis, is of great interest to a lot of your marketing companies that are, drawing inferences about whether I'm more likely to be a Diet Coke drinker, or, whether my, children, based on their clicking on everything Minecraft, are likely to, or not likely to, go the way of Roblox. So a lot of inferences to be drawn on the personal level. But also, we spend a lot of time talking about just contractual and other sort of bases for rights in data. So companies, are sharing data all the time and have agreed through their terms and conditions or their contracts that you have a right to do X, Y, and Z with my data, but you don't have a right to do A, B, or C. So it's really interesting from just a very granular level, watching companies negotiating what rights they do have, which becomes the legal basis for what they can and can't do, and interpreting those rights, helps inform the kind of should and shouldn't as well. But also, then companies, and for those of you kind of looking at this from a governance perspective, how do you track and monitor then what rights you have in your various databases and data assets, and are you, are the various businesses within the company complying with those rights and sort of adequately caring for the rights that they have and don't have. So it really, in some ways, it's easy to talk about it in terms of, big picture. It's actually very difficult to execute and implement on, kind of a day-to-day level. So sometimes we see even companies that are trying to do the right thing, Greg, from your ethical perspective, actually just stumbling over the sort of messiness of their databases and data warehouses, and, trying to sort that out. I think that's why we see so many data, big data companies in the news who are trying to help companies solve those problems. So again, none of this is easy. Sort of, we look at contract language, we look at regulations, and totally agree that the right frame for this discussion is that, legal requirements, whether those come from regulations or from contractual agreements parties have made, that's an angle we need to look at, but it's not the only angle, and there often is a gap. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you'd like to show up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in a story about what you've done. And, that's a different test. Or as we've seen today, getting hauled into Congress to testify about your practices. So obviously these are top of mind, and I'm so grateful to be here and to hear what Greg and Dennis and Gary have to share as well.
Great. So, Greg, let's sort of get into some of the practical considerations. You work with companies all the time trying to build out their data and analytics organizations. And spending a lot of money trying to do that. What do you think makes them successful, not successful? What are some of the key things to think about?
I think this whole idea of building out a chief data officer in companies, we've seen that emerge for years now. And then a buildup of people inside that organization to support the chief data officer, where we're seeing political hagglings which impact the ethical use of the information, is that an executive might come to this group and say, I need a report, or I need some analysis that tells me this. And so they've already kind of said what the answer needs to be. And with data and information, you can weave it and make it say what it needs to be. So the success often needs to be, where is this data organization housed, who owns it, and understand the politics around it. And as a board member, sometimes that is not real transparent when you're just hearing about it. But I think those are some questions you really want to understand. But truth be told, the failure of a number of data organizations that have been built has been because people are afraid to use the data in a certain way, and they're not sure that it's ethical or appropriate, or if they buy data that it's okay to use it. And those inferences, Anna, that you were talking about, is it okay to actually use those things? So as a result, these investments have just not yielded as much as anybody ever dreamed. And so having some governance around and letting people have permission to cross-check and say, hey, is it okay for us to use this information this way or not, will really help to yield a lot more value for the organization.
And Dennis, from your perspective, what should boards be thinking about to sort of address governance? Like what steps should they be taking as a group?
Yeah, so what I'm seeing, and I spend time with a lot of my day is spent with marketers or folks, executives that sit up in the front office. There's a question about using customer data for things like customer service. And there's a process here where companies are maturing in terms of their comfort with using customer data. There are some companies that are really, really good at using customer data, and there's some companies that are not very good, and it's all a work in progress here. But you see some companies that have a very good story around how they use customer data for marketing purposes, for sales purposes, interacting with existing customers. And that over time, I think will progress throughout the entire value chain of the company for customer service, for customer support and the like. But there's a lot of effort, at least what I've seen over the last, say, 5 or 10 years, where companies are understanding the power of data. And that's not just power in terms of growing the company that that executive works for, but also in terms of interacting and creating a very rich experience for the consumers or the customers they interact with. So everything's a work in progress, but I do think there's momentum building where companies and individuals are getting very, very smart in terms of what they can and can't do with things like customer data. When I interact with various companies, with various brands, there's a few sort of best practices that I think are popping up here. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly. You'll see boards that are making this a board level discussion. It may just be a topic for a particular quarterly board meeting, but they make it an explicit discussion. And at times they will bring in experts just to ask what is going on out there that we need to be aware of. They're getting educated. They're trying to build up those capabilities, those competencies around this topic of data and around the topic of data privacy and ethical use of that data. I'm also seeing chief data officers show up, but those are operational roles. You'll have another role that I'm seeing that has been popping up where the general counsel typically gets tapped to be either the chief privacy officer or the chief data ethics officer. That's a role that's starting to emerge, particularly in those B2C companies that are very progressive with the use and the management of customer data. So that's one other consideration. These companies tend to lay out their data ethics principles. Sometimes they turn that into a policy statement. Some even go so far as to have an explicit program around managing customer data, just to make sure they're staying ahead of all the laws and regulations, but also all the considerations, the ethical considerations. Some of these companies are thinking about annual awareness and training programs and perhaps even audits throughout the year. I have seen a lot of companies, particularly financial services companies, that are very, want to make sure that all employees know the do's and don'ts associated with the use of data. And they do tend to audit not just themselves, but also vendors that they're working with to make sure there's good practices across the board. And then finally, when you look over in the product and engineering or the development, the R&D organizations, you see some of these companies thinking about privacy by design. They are trying to be proactive to make sure that their offerings are considerate of privacy and ethical use of data. And that's something that I see popping up more and more, just companies trying to be proactive rather than reactive as it relates to embedding privacy in their products, their service and product offerings.
Great conversation. You guys are bringing some really good perspective. Actually, my question is for really all of you guys, right? Yeah, Dennis, you mentioned the data governance, right? The need for that, the data officer. Greg, you mentioned a couple of things. What I'm observing is data and AI governance, they actually kind of go together. I think there is a pushback, right, in terms of having the chief data officer, those types of roles. I think that's been my observation. I'm kind of seeing, how do you see those evolving? Because it seems like it needs to evolve in order to really answer this question, right? As AI gets in more using data, I don't know how we're going to solve this. So any thoughts or comments or topics on it?
And can you elaborate on, you're saying how it's evolving. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? What's your...
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are companies considering having governance, right? Governance framework around both data and AI coming together. And what are some of the ways to do it? If not, what are the ways to be able to do this?
Right. If I may, I'll go ahead and get started with this.
Please.
I think over the last 10, maybe 15 years, security was a big effort, and boards really brought this up on the agenda. There was a hyper focus on this because there's so much concern, so much sensitivity around a breach of data. And when you go out and look at most boards, they've got a pretty good line of sight on what's happening from a security perspective. And we're hitting a level of maturity where a lot of companies have a pretty good story around security posture, security policy, security principles, security audits, security programs, training, and the like. And I think the evolution of that is, okay, let's start talking about privacy. Let's start talking about ethical use of data. And we're early days right now. But I do think over the coming years, we'll see more and more focus. And you see more and more regulation coming out. CCPA is out now. GDPR is out now. There's probably 30, 40 states that are contemplating their own form of regulation. There's even this idea of, national regulation here within the US, right? We'll see how that goes. But there's a lot of moving parts here where momentum is building up on this topic of privacy and ethical use of data. And where we were, 10 or 15 years ago with the topic of data security, I think that's where we're at today with respect to data privacy and data ethics. And over the next 10 years, we'll progress, and 10 years later, there'll be some other topic. But right now, I do think folks are dialing in and they're trying to figure out, what do I do now? And over time, we will develop better capabilities for addressing data privacy and ethical use of data. That's my opinion.
If I can jump in there too, just to build on something Dennis said around kind of the auditing, both kind of internal audits and monitoring of data use. I think, Dennis, you mentioned that kind of, at least an annual review is a good best practice. And also auditing vendors and compliance. One trend we've seen that I think is good for everyone to keep in mind is, historically, a lot of contracts sitting in file drawers collecting dust, included rights to audit and monitor vendor performance. It included very carefully negotiated rules around what maybe vendors or technology partners can and can't do. But again, those were collecting dust, and people were not maybe sort of exercising those rights. And one trend I've seen, and I'm curious, Greg and Dennis, if you've seen the same thing, is that there's a lot more care being given now, first of all, to actually exercising the rights that you have, to actually go out and monitor and do those audits, because I think we've seen some companies get into trouble when they've had the rights but not used them. And actually, interestingly, I don't know if this is a good or a bad development, I think companies are being more careful about what rights they ask for when it comes to auditing and monitoring, because they know that they might be scrutinized if they don't actually avail themselves of those rights. So I don't know if others are seeing those trends, Greg or Dennis.
Well, and you have to know, I'm in a certain part of the market where this topic is on fire, and that is within marketing. Most marketers who are progressive marketers, they are knee deep in the world of how to use customer data properly. And when they issue RFPs out to vendors like Acoustic, there are requirements in terms of use of customer data. And they signal, this is our expectation of you as a vendor. If we select you, you're going to adhere to these requirements, whatever those requirements are for them, whatever's important to them. And it shows up that early. They are embedding it. They tell procurement, you make sure every RFP, you embed these requirements. And by the way, as you go through that RFP process, that usually kicks off some type of privacy assessment, some type of security assessment. So very early in that life cycle where companies are engaging third parties, they're setting those expectations. And then to come over to Anna's point, once the contract gets laid out, that's another way to institutionalize the requirements that third parties and even the company itself is going to, what set of rules they're going to play by, right? And we see that all the time where we're negotiating against those requirements with a company around data security and lately data privacy and ethical use of data. Those come up and you get the relationship set up properly so that as you get through the life of that engagement, of that relationship with the company, you're playing by rules that are embedded into the contractual vehicles. There's expectations, of course, beyond that, that we're all going to do the right thing, but companies, progressive companies are getting very smart about how to wire the rules of the game properly right out the gate.
Essentially, what's happening here is customer data and a lot of other information is being ingested by artificial intelligence systems in order to help to make better decisions. By better, meaning we're going to use these AI models to predict what's the best person to receive a loan or whatever your operational issue is. And that's why the bias comes in. It's like, wait a minute, are we really just going to copy the decisions of the past, train our machines to learn those, and then in an even more biased way, because the machine learning artificial intelligence just makes more consistently bad choices. So believe me, this is just a top of mind concern in the building of the models and looking through the data for these anomalies, that I think the types of questions that are popping up here on the panel are things that companies who are providing models in AI are able to prove out. It's a competitive advantage for them to show, here's how we identified this bias, pulled it out, and our models are better, and those are ones you should leverage. So we're seeing this as explainable AI. All of these offerings are competitive advantages for companies because they just see that the market is very concerned about the bias in the data. So I don't know if others have comments on that.
I had just a follow-up question on that is, are you seeing more regulations coming down the pipe, perhaps in that area where, apart from the fact that companies start doing better because it is a competitive advantage, but then regulation also pushes them in that direction?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think as so many areas of kind of technology law, the laws are really lagging behind the development of technology. I'm not confident they'll really ever catch up. And so it's an interesting area because I think there's a lot of attention being paid to, you get regulations on specific issues like, personal information and privacy. We've seen regulation, including in Illinois, on sort of biometric data that can be really interesting, especially with all these data-driven devices. And, I walk down the street and I don't know kind of who's looking at my eyes and figuring out who I am, going to start handing me products, in real life. We've kind of seen digital advertising coming to brick and mortar, kind of day-to-day life. And it's interesting. I'm not, for better or worse, I don't think the regulations will catch up. There is a lot of attention being paid to AI. And, I think some of those themes of predictive analytics that Greg mentioned and, kind of the explainable AI, I think we'll see, regulations pushing at the edges, again, kind of trying to require, to the extent they can, kind of AI companies, at least in certain areas, more sensitive areas, to be able to explain what's in that black box. And I think that is interesting, and it will be an area, as Greg said, where companies are, possibly able to differentiate themselves. Sometimes, that's the beauty of these models, is that they learn faster than humans, and sometimes it takes some reverse engineering to go back and figure out how those decisions were being made.
There's something called Radical AI. It's a great podcast. It's all about ethics and the use of AI. And I think Kathy Baxter from Salesforce, who has a whole business at Salesforce on the ethical use of technology with their platforms. Their platforms are the Salesforce platforms available to build AI and other tools. So we'll send that along if you want to listen and learn a little bit more about these topics. I think that it's a terrific resource.
And my question really just had to be around the whole notion of a chief data officer. It seems a prevailing opinion is that the duties of that role should rest in other people that are already in the company. And I was just wondering if there were any approaches that had worked that seemed to make inroads into getting that kind of a position.
From my perspective, I think this is an open switch, right? There's an experiment underway. Some companies do have a chief data officer, and sometimes that's called a chief analytics officer, right? Mm-hmm. They're really trying to make sure they've got more or less an umbrella over the company just to see what's going on. Maybe there's some efficiencies and synergies, but also just to make sure everybody's playing by the rules. And then there's other companies that do subscribe to, hey, I do not want to centralize this into one role or one office. And we'll let the business units or the functions figure this out. There's some cost associated with that, right? Folks are going to roll their own. They're going to go into a direction that may not be consistent with what the corporation wants to do. But I'm not sure if anybody's landed on a best practice here. But there is a lot of different variations underway here. And maybe over time, as we collectively mature, we'll figure out, which way is better than the other.
I agree with Dennis on that. I would suggest as board members to be asking what's the root cause? Why is it that we're creating a chief data officer, or what's really driving that, and understand the issues in the organization, because data's been in companies forever. It's a competency, how to use and leverage data. It's across all business units. So what is driving this separation of it and the creation and focus and all of that? And sometimes it's around recruiting. A number of clients before pandemic would be moving the data and analytics functions down into the West Loop, or just to create some excitement around it to be able to attract people. So you really have to try to figure out what it is that's going on in the organization and just ask those questions.
Greg, I think you really nailed it too, in terms of, data isn't new, but I think technology is enabling us to collect data kind of in certain places, crunch numbers, run analytics. There's, a lot smarter sort of data scientists available for recruiting even at this point. And, but it's good to kind of go back to the basics and remember, especially kind of data that's collected in the course of running a business. Like, data grows organically in silos. It grows in those kind of business and product lines. And there's a lot of, kind of folks all the way up and down the chain that are touching data, that are making decisions on a daily basis that impact what data are we collecting, where are we storing it, how are we using that. And so I think that chief data officer role, or even if there's not a specific role, if the board or upper management are kind of asking hard questions, it sort of helps orchestrate sort of what's going on throughout the company. And I do think that companies that are kind of out on the forefront of this and are thinking of data now as one of our most valuable assets, and thinking of, all the ways to manage that, it's a really key issue.
What are you typically seeing boards doing? Do they review data governance policies, et cetera, once a quarter? once a year? Like, what is the kind of rigor the, boards are putting in terms of data governance?
Well, if I can get started with this, again, I think there's a continuum here. There's some companies that aren't dialed in, maybe they don't care, maybe they're not aware. And then there's the other companies at the other end of the continuum, very progressive, and they're really trying to figure this out. So I'll talk about those companies. Maybe that's the upper quartile on the continuum. And, they, much like if you looked at the board agenda over a year, you've got 4 board meetings, quarterly board meetings, and they worry about things like long-range plan. They worry about board effectiveness, but then you'll see security on there. That's an annual topic for a lot of those progressive companies. I think that's the idea. Let's raise this first just as a one-off topic. Let's just get started. Let's open up the conversation. Maybe we can bring an expert in just to help frame this properly. And let's figure out what we're going to do. What kind of governance? Who are we going to tap as our chief privacy officer, chief data officer, chief data ethics officer, whatever is important to that company? What are the principles? Are we going to have awareness and training programs? Are we going to have an annual audit? All that can open up. But then over time, I think as the company progresses, that becomes a normal part of the agenda. Every year, there's going to be some amount of time when we come in, as much as we talk about strategy, as much as we talk about security, let's make sure we talk about data privacy and ethical use of data, particularly if consumer data matters to our business, right? There was a question that came up from Holly that talks about B2B versus B2C. Now, B2C, they have to care about this. I mean, it is the business. They want to touch those consumers digitally. They're going to have to know a lot about data, and they're going to have to manage that data properly. But in a B2B context, what's happening? Let's say we're working with HP. Those are consumers that are employees of HP, and the tactics for interacting with consumers are the same tactics for interacting with buyers. We need to make, I think this is as relevant of a topic in the B2B world as it is in the B2C world. It's all about interaction with either a commercial customer or a retail or a consumer. The plays that are being run, the use of data for both B2B and B2C are very similar. And I think all companies need to be thinking about this, because all companies use customer data. They have customers, right?
But I will say at the board level, you had the question about at the board. Once again, chief data officers, they aren't really focused on this ethics thing, like this worksheet that we provided to you. They are there largely because they need to build out an architecture. They need to clean that data. It's a mess. People are looking for answers from the information, and there's all kinds of holes and just bad data. That's what they're worried about. From a board perspective, though, you could introduce this. Hey, what are we doing? What's the process to make sure that once you actually get this data cleaned up, that we're going to use it in a way that generates insights and we're not going to be tripping all over the market or tripping all over people's human rights when we use it, so that we have some defensible position to describe why and how we're using this information. That is not what they're mostly worried about. That needs to be brought up.
I think there's a lot of focus on, what are the limitations? What should we not be doing with data? I think another thing that you can introduce at the board level and make sure that management is thinking about is actually, what can we do with the data we have? And part of sometimes, cleaning up that garbage in, garbage out problem and figuring out what is this rich data set that we have and what can we do with that, right? So companies are thinking about, could we be doing things in predictive analytics that are completely within the ethical and legal framework, but that we're not doing, right? What could we be learning about our own business internally or about market trends? You hear about we've all read the story about, when Target figured out someone was pregnant before, she even knew herself, or, those are kind of newsworthy items about predictive analytics, but that's actually a really valuable tool within your business, things you could be doing with your data. benchmarking tools and sort of, ways that you can monetize those data assets, that can create entire new business lines, if the management feels comfortable that that's, within that legal and ethical framework. And that's something that your businesses, may be so busy and caught up in their day-to-day that they're not thinking big about data as an asset. And in the B2B space in particular, Dennis, I'm sure you see this, there can be a bit of a tug of war when there are opportunities for predictive analytics or benchmarking or monetizing data. It's a little bit like, well, who gets that revenue stream, right? Is it the sort of, service provider that's crunching the data that gets kind of rights to aggregated, anonymized data to monetize that, or does that go back to the business customer? So I think some of those big picture issues, again, I think the companies in, what Dennis referred to as the sort of top quartile of forward thinkers are, this is already on the agenda. But if it's not on the agenda of a company that, you're working with, I think it's worth considering putting it on there.
And Dennis, just coming back to the B2B versus B2C question, I guess what was going through my mind is it seems like a lot of the data you could collect if you're in a B2C company is more personal or could be more personal than a lot of the data that you might be collecting in B2B, because, how I choose to spend my discretionary money is a little bit different in a B2C company than, what pump do I want to buy? What brand pump am I going to look at? Or, that sort of thing. So that's what I was trying to get in my mind. And I'm thinking back to Greg's, I think it was his second slide that had the 4 quadrants on it too. And it just seems like there might be different emphasis on those quadrants for B2B versus B2C. So any other comments you have on that?
I didn't know if Greg was going to jump in here. I will tell you, I worked at Acxiom. For those that don't know, Acxiom is a 50-year-old company that sells consumer data. They have a database, a pristine database of consumer data where Acxiom will go out to big companies and help them enrich what's called their first-party data. 3,000 different attributes for well over 2 billion different consumers globally. And B2C, it's very mature what they're doing with all of that data, right? And those 3,000 attributes. When you add in technology and in particular AI, it's very powerful. In fact, so powerful, look at the valuations of Google and Facebook, right? To tell you everything you need to know about, the power of bringing data and technology together in the consumer space. That is starting to pour over into the B2B space. At least that's what I'm seeing. Not quite there, not the level of maturity you see in B2C, but accessing, commercial buyers through Facebook, through Google, through every digital channel that they're accessing through consumers, doing diagnostics and predictive analytics on those individuals that are buyers within companies, the B2B buyers, lots of similarity there. And you're right, there's probably not all of that data is applicable, but it feels like a rinse and repeat. They're taking all the B2C practices and they're moving it over into the B2B world so that they can interact with those B2B customers.
And Holly, to your question, well, among the 4 ethical filters, I think utilitarian, that one where you're kind of trying to estimate the benefits versus the harms that a company could do, is going to be a little bit more prevalent in the B2B world as compared to the human rights and the duty of care and that sort of thing. You want to make sure what you're doing is not going to hurt the market. So that's probably where I would say that really needs to be an important analysis as industrial companies are taking a look at how to use the data. I see another question here around where the data ethics officer reports. And Dennis, I think you've really been the lead on even creating that idea of a data ethics officer. You want to comment on that one?
Sure. And there's any number of ways you could set this office and this executive up, whether you call it a data privacy officer or a data ethics officer. But at Acxiom and here at Acoustic, I have tapped my general counsel to be responsible for, to serve as the Chief Data Ethics Officer. And the reason for that is I do think the foundation here is data privacy. There are regulations, there are laws, we have to comply to those laws, and we have to be aware of what's coming down the pike in terms of additional regulations. So that's just a natural connection to our general counsel. And then to me, it's a very easy link into the general counsel serving as the Chief Data Ethics Officer. The general counsel typically is sitting in the board meetings. And it's just, there's a lot of, a lot less friction in getting that individual in particular to step into this role and make sure that they're setting up governance, they're setting up policy, they're setting up principles, just really riding herd over this to make sure that they're coming into the board and helping them understand this topic and just keeping an eye on things day to day as it relates to all things data privacy and ethical use of data.
And I haven't seen a lot of ethics officers, but I have seen even in large corporations, it's a direct report to the CEO. It's not like there's a whole bunch of staff and all sorts of things to worry about there. So it's not like it's an administrative burden, but it's direct advice, and I think it shows a good message. That's something else to think about in terms of that individual's role.
Yeah, and you've seen a variation of this. Sometimes, at least what I've seen, the CIO tends to have the Chief Security Officer reporting in, so it's really a part of their role. There's a lot of technology there. At least this is what I've seen in general. There's plenty of exceptions, but use what you have already in place. There's a general counsel in place. They've got a team there, and it's a nice little bolt-on. I think that's at least how I propose getting started.
I'll jump in. Dennis, you had mentioned, obviously, Google and Facebook, the huge companies. Some newer companies like Databricks and Snowflake have gotten a lot of news over the last year. I guess this is to you, Anna. What do you think, these types of data analytics, data warehouses, businesses, why are they so much in the focus of Wall Street now? Great
question. Yeah, certainly they're in the focus of Wall Street because I think so many companies are realizing this, data is an asset, and a lot of their data collections are not pristine, clean data collections like Dennis described Acxiom having with, careful attention paid to a clean database. I think a lot of us have, the equivalent of a bunch of papers and Post-its all over our desk that aren't in the sort of, they're not clean. They need to be ingested into a sort of a format that they can be that somebody can make sense out of them. Otherwise, you're kind of comparing apples to oranges. And so I think these data companies that we're seeing in the news, with Snowflake's IPO and with Databricks getting, the sort of big investment from Amazon, Alphabet, and Salesforce all teaming up to invest in that company, I think we're just seeing, a sort of a market need being filled there, both from the kind of warehousing and also the analytics perspective, helping companies solve this problem of, kind of how do we manage and track and clean up our data so that we can sort of make sense out of it, both for internal tracking purposes as well as, to kind of keep up with these trends.
Yeah, and if I could riff off of that, there's two things going on, at least what I'm seeing. A lot of us 15 years ago or 15 plus years ago, we had never heard of the word cloud in the context of how it's used today. We didn't hear of the acronym SaaS, software as a service, but today we all know cloud, we all know SaaS. That's a very common part of the vernacular, if you will, the vocabulary that we have within any company. And we're feeling pretty comfortable about that. So think of the last 10 or 15 years as moving software into the cloud. I think the next 10 to 15 years, and this is all part of what I'm saying about evolution, right? Think there's a new topic that we need to worry about, and that's around data. And what we're seeing is a move of data into the cloud. And with that, you're seeing these companies that are getting sizable investments. They have sizable valuations because they're ahead of the game. They're trying to help companies get data into the cloud. The software's there, the technology's there. Now it's time for the data to catch up. And the second thing that I would throw out here is that you know, the companies that do take the time to get ahead here, you know, whether it's AI, whether it's technology, whether it's data, they're realizing this is a way to grow their company. The rules of the game are changing, if you will, and much like Google and Facebook, they've run this play for 10 or 15 years. Everybody can see the power of what they're doing. The consumers value it. Companies value using Google and Facebook as a marketing platform. But I think the second thing that's happening is brands are saying, hey, I want the control. I don't want Facebook and Google to have the control of my consumers. I think I can do this on my own. They're bringing in companies that like Snowflake to help them build up these capabilities so that they can control their destiny. They're not beholden to the Facebooks or the Googles. They have these capabilities internally. They can manage the relationship with their consumers directly, and they're building up their confidence to do that. And they're using these third parties like Snowflake to make that happen.
Do you see anywhere a possibility that, you know, the customers will slowly get the rights to price their data and monetize the data? So it's now the end customer saying, hey, you know, organization, if you want to keep my usage data or something, you need to pay me for that. Do you all see anything like that happening?
I think there's a lot of that already happening in the B2B space. It's interesting. There's some great TED Talks out there if you want to, you know, kind of see people who are trying to start a movement of each of us individually kind of, you know, starting to charge companies for the data we've been giving them for free, you know, on a B2C level. I think B2B is maybe actually ahead of the curve in terms of understanding that data is a form of currency now, and that, you know, sort of just letting a service provider sort of, you know, get rights beyond providing a service, you know, for providing a service, getting those rights for free, right, is something that's, I think, at the negotiating table. You know, Dennis, I don't know what trends you're seeing there.
Yeah, and I've seen the TED Talks, by the way. There are companies out there that are trying to pick the center of gravity up as it relates to consumer data off the brands or off the companies and move it over to the consumer, so the consumer has control. I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical. I don't see that really materializing in a big way.
There is some blockchain development in this space. Now, Dennis, to your point, I don't know how far along we are, but the idea would be you have an immutable record of everything about yourself, your favorite color and all of that. And if you choose to reveal that to a company, then you could charge for that. So, but we've seen some of that stuff, but then, you know, how far along or whatever. But yes, there are people looking to monetize this at the individual level.
I'm the person who would forget my password to my blockchain database, and just like that guy with his Bitcoin investment loss.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the way to think about this, though, is you had the walled gardens, the Facebooks and the Googles that had control of the consumer data, and that play's been run very successfully. The next big phase is the brands, the companies are starting to take control of that data, and maybe, you know, 15 plus years out, the next thing we'll be talking about here on one of these forums is the consumer has the control.
Yeah.
But I do think that's a ways off here.
And that's public policy, right? I mean, in the United States, we were so far behind what Europe was. We thought Europe was, oh, they're just fuddy-duddy people. They're so worried about privacy of information. And we were just having it stolen from us by these amazing companies that figured out how to monetize it well before we even realized what was going on. And the public policy, Washington wasn't worried about it because people weren't worried about whatever. So that's kind of where we are. And what we've seen along the way. So maybe 15 years, that would be interesting, but it's going to take fundamental shift in public policy around the value of this personal information, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, with that, why don't we ask each of our panelists to just spend a minute or two with sort of the most critical key takeaways for the group? And we'll start with Greg.
I'd be glad to start with that. One of my friends is Cord Davis, which is why I have his book out here, Ethics in Big Data. And I reached out, he wrote that in 2012, and I reached out to him and say, okay, it's 10 years hence. What have we learned? And his point was all around transparency. And I think, Dennis, you hit on that right in the beginning. We can reduce the risk of being attacked because we're handling data inappropriately if we increase the use of that data to improve the customer experience. So instead of just saying we're keeping everything private, if we actually have our customers experience online with us because we know stuff about them, but at the same time, tell them what we're doing. Listen, we're going to sell this information. We're going to use this in a way to interact with you, and just be honest about how we're using the data. And that will be a good way to manage risk and build loyalty. That's the key here, is you want to build loyalty so that if something does happen and you are under fire in social media, you have loyalists coming to your aid saying, hey, they told us they were going to do this and we really want them to do well. So that's one piece. The second is, it's not just about ethics and big data or AI. It's really broad emerging technologies that are converging. And I bring up quantum as an example for everybody to be thinking about, the whole new way of computing that's coming out way faster than we ever thought it would be. And so the ethical questions around AI and quantum are, who has the right to benefit from this technology first? In life sciences, we could be simulating chemical reactions instantly rather than over months and years. And so the idea would be, should we focus quantum on life sciences and health applications? Or what about optimization of portfolios and simulation of financial portfolios so we make a lot of money on it? So the idea is, whether it's AI, whether it's quantum, broadly, these emerging technologies around data, fundamentally, these are questions that people should be asking and understanding at a board level. What's the philosophy of the company in this space? So those are a couple takeaways.
I love that. And if I may go next, one story I'll share with you, going back to Acxiom, a database of 2 billion consumers worldwide. We set up a website where you could opt out. 1.9% of that, all those individuals in that database opted out. And it was kind of a yawner. And what we learned is that consumers don't want to opt out. They want to opt out of bad companies that are doing bad things with their data. But if you can strike a value exchange with those consumers to say, hey, I'm going to create a great experience. I'm going to have innovative ways where I can interact with you because you want to interact. We want to interact with one another. And I'm going to be responsible as it relates to the use of your data. And to the extent that you want to opt out, I'm going to let you opt out. And I'm going to provide you with transparency. I'm going to provide you with control. But as long as you stay in, I know I have an obligation as a company, as a brand, to take care of you, to create that great experience, and to make sure all the while I'm taking care of your data. That's part of the value exchange. And most consumers, I think, are on board with that. That's fine. Make sure you don't do anything bad with my data. Make sure you're creating a good experience. I'm in. And the minute you breach that trust, they're out. And you need to give them the ability to get out. And I think that's where things are going. That's what we need to be thinking about. We can go out and talk to consumers. We do this all the time, and just to ask them what's important. And they'll tell you, I'm in. You can have the data, you can use the data, but use it responsibly. And I really think that's what's in front of us, whether it's the board, whether it's executives, companies as a whole, is put in programs, put in a statement of principles, put in policies, put in the awareness programs, the training programs, the audit programs, everything we've talked about, a chief data ethics officer, to make sure you can govern over that data, use it responsibly, and make sure you're doing right, you're building that trust up with those consumers that are depending on you as a company to use their data properly going forward.
Terrific.
That's great. Before I share my takeaway, Dennis, you reminded me, I'm often a person who values that, value added customer experience. I just wish there was a way if you look at shoes or a stand-up desk and it follows you around on the internet until you make the purchase. I wish there was a way to tell it, I've made the purchase or I've moved on from wanting these shoes, and stop following me now.
I'm with you on that.
The algorithm's not quite smart enough yet to know that I bought the desk or I've changed my taste in shoes. I think my key takeaway is, just building on what Greg and Dennis have said, that, I think from a board and management level, it's really important to think of data as an asset, a very valuable asset that doesn't have a clear line item on the balance sheets you're looking at. It's not always clear how it fits in, but data is an asset, and we have to recognize that it's not something to be afraid of, and careful planning and thoughtful data governance can really lead to more and not less use of that data and sources and uses, opportunities for your companies. So I think the higher degree of confidence that a company has in its process for collecting and tracking and monitoring its use of data, and keeping the data that is valuable, and not keeping or collecting data that's not valuable, that sort of data minimization principle is important as well. I think the more confidence a company has in a robust data program, I think the stronger and sort of more ahead of the curve those companies will be.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much to the panel. Holly, we'll turn it over to you for some closing comments.
Yeah, well, first of all, wow, what a fantastic panel for this topic. This has been really just a great set of backgrounds and experiences to address this topic. So thank you, Anna, Dennis, Greg, and Gary, for taking the time to share your insights. This is such an important topic for directors, as expectations on use of data is changing over time. Consumers and corporate buyers are getting a lot smarter about what they want and how they want it handled. So fantastic, fantastic panel. So I want to thank everyone for attending. And again, once again, our fabulous panel on this topic. Panel members have agreed to stay on for up to 30 minutes beyond this time if you want to ask any further questions or just to network with your peers. So with that, if you're signing off, thank you very much. And if you're staying on, then we'll be on for a bit longer.